Medical ethics. Difficult subject because I'm no scientist, as everyone knows, and as I think I've demonstrated a few times during this series. But there's still some principles within God's Word that allows us to make determination whether a medical practice is right or wrong. And we, at the beginning of this series, and we've reminded you every time, and we'll do it again next week when I think we'll probably conclude this, there's three basic principles that can be used in determining most of these matters. The first of those is the sanctity of human life, realizing that man is a creation of God. The second is the honor, dignity, and the respect of man, that man did not evolve from lower life forms. He was created in the image of God, and God pronounced that very good at the end of that creation, Genesis 1:21. The third of those deals with the sacredness of the family unit, that God saw the need for a family unit, a husband and wife. And anything thus that would attempt to circumvent that home as God designed it would certainly be wrong. We also noted, because it's so important, people's intent is so many times the determining factor whether something is right or something is wrong. That the action itself is neither inherently evil, it is in that sense, and I'll use the term neutral along that line. It could be done, it could not be done, it doesn't have to be. But a person's intent of doing that action might be would make it where they would be violating one of those principles. And as such, then it would become wrong, even though the action itself is not necessarily. And so that plays a vital role in medical ethics as well. So, as we have been going through this study, we come to the subject that Paul wanted to discuss a long time ago, and that is surrogacy. Very basic principle of surrogacy is that a fertilized egg will be implanted into a woman's womb, who then carries that child to term, generally for someone else. Or the woman might allow herself to be artificially inseminated so that she can have a child naturally as opposed to adoption. The idea of surrogacy deals with both aspects of that. There are basically two types of surrogacy. The first would be traditional surrogacy, where the child is the genetic, or comes from the genetics of the mother. And so it is the mother's DNA in the actual egg in which is going to be used. The second type is gestational surrogacy. This is where there is no genetic relationship that occurs in the surrogacy itself. So those are the two basic types. When you're discussing this subject, not to get into really the details of surrogacy itself, but we need to remember that childbearing was not designed to be a means or an end in itself. It was never God's intention simply to procreate. and have no other aspect other than procreation. Instead, God's design was and having children was part of a larger and a grander plan. God's plan is for man to glorify and serve Him. We're studying Ecclesiastes on Wednesday nights, and Paul is doing an excellent job in that study, but the summation statement in chapter 12 and verse 13 shows us this very point when he says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man." God designed man for the purpose of glorifying Him and serving Him. And that's what Solomon learns as he goes through all of these things in life. Here's what the whole summation of life is about. It's fearing God and keeping His commandments. That's what God's design for man is. Isaiah writes in Isaiah 43 and verse 7 that even every one that is called by my name, for I have created him, now notice this, for my glory. I have formed him, yes, I have made him. I created him, though, for my glory, God says. Again, we see the purpose and intent for man. We were created to glorify God. And we could go through a lot of things if we were dealing with the subject of the purpose of man. It's not to glorify himself. It's not to make a lot of money. It's not to be popular. It's not to have a lot of friends and influence people. It's not to have creature comforts. It's not all of those things. God created man to glorify Him. Thus, when we come to the family relationship and God's design for the family, it's going to be the exact same thing. The family was designed so that man could better glorify God. And in relationship to childbearing in particular, the very purpose of that childbearing and child rearing is to bring that child to where he understands that the proper life to live is that of glorifying God. Childbearing is not an end of itself, to see how many children we can produce. Some through the years, I believe, have gotten the mistaken impression that that is the purpose of life, just to see how many children they can produce. And many of them will do so as it doesn't matter whether they're married or not. It just go out and find whoever will allow it and have children. But there is a parental responsibility. That parental responsibility begins at conception, the time in which life begins. And it does not end until the child is raised to that point or that level of independence where he has an understanding and a maturity where he can live on his own or her own and understands that responsibility that he has of glorifying God within his life. Now that by the very discussion of that, while we say a level of independent maturity, in many respects, that parental responsibility never ends. It continues on. Even when a child is raised to maturity and that independent maturity, that responsibility as a parent is still there. I think just about all of us realize that. That even though our children might be out of our home, that we still feel a responsibility to them, don't we? How many times do our children maybe need a little bit of money here or there, and the parent who would not loan the money to someone else, but they will certainly provide it for their child. Why? Because they feel that parental responsibility even though the child's out of the home. We understand that in some ways that responsibility to our children never comes to an end. The greater part of that, though, in relationship to childbearing, is the rearing of that child for God's service. Solomon would write in Proverbs 22 and verse 6, to train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it. Well, part of that training, obviously, if you go back to the Old Testament and you can start in Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter in particular, where it says a father is to teach his children when he sits down, when he rises up, and he just goes through a long list of things. He is to be teaching that child godly principles throughout his life, or from the very beginning of his understanding. Why? You teach them the law of Moses in regards to those individuals. Why? Because that's a parent's responsibility of training that child in God's service. In the New Testament, we see the same principle in Ephesians, the 6th chapter, starting in verse 1, where it gives the children's responsibility. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. There's the child's responsibility to the parent in those first 3 verses. And part of that is honoring father and mother. You honor the parents. That shows that parental responsibility, though, as well, because part of that honoring your parents is going to be that training that you have received from the parents in living faithful to that training. But then in verse 4, he turns it around in relationship to the parent, or the father in particular, in relationship to his child. What's the father's responsibility? Well, ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. He doesn't simply state to us, ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up to maturity. Bring them up to where they can live independently on their own. No, there is a spiritual responsibility that is given to the fathers, and in particular, but to the parents in general. And that is a spiritual training. Now then, when you're dealing with that training and bringing them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, and we won't go through a study of this afternoon, but there is the restraining of that child as well as the training of the child. The restraining would be stopping them from doing that which is wrong. And that some restraining sometimes will take the form of applying the Board of Education at the seat of learning, as the old statement goes. And some of us have felt that plenty of times. And it trained us not to do certain things. But there's also the training, that is the instruction that is to be given, a teaching of them by word of mouth and by example. Sadly, sometimes we see parents who will teach them by word of mouth one thing, but will live a lifestyle that's different than what they say. And guess which one the child follows after? It's not going to be the one that is stated, it's the one that's lived. So we have to live a training of our children. Live in such a way that we bring them up to that level of spiritual maturity to follow after God and to serve Him. Now then, with that as an understanding, we go back to the idea of surrogacy. When we surrender our reproductive powers to another person, then would we not be neglecting and abdicating our parental responsibilities to an arrangement beyond the family unit? It could very well be. If that is the case, then are we not neglecting and abdicating our divine responsibilities within the family unit and within those reproductive powers? Or even more so, having a child, as is done by some today, for the purpose of selling it to the highest bidder, generally, to get more money, or even to give it away voluntarily, would certainly be a violation of those principles that God has set for the family unit and for the reproductive nature of the family unit. Reproduction is to take place within the family unit, not outside of it. With surrogacy, and here you come back to intent to a great extent. But there are situations certainly that the intent is to have a child within the family unit and to bring that child up within that family unit in relationship to the spiritual principles that that child should have. And you use that in order to accomplish such. But what would be, or what would prevent a single mother, single woman should say, allowing herself to be artificially inseminated to simply avoid the inconvenience, as many would view it, of marriage? A woman, a single woman out here, does not want to be married, doesn't want that lifestyle, but she wants a child. Well, here's the way in which I can get one. I will be artificially inseminated. I will have that opportunity, and then I can have a child on my own, and I can raise that child without any father being in the picture. The intent of that would be to go outside that marriage relationship that God has designed for the family and for reproduction. Or what would prevent two lesbians or two homosexual men, one of the lesbians allowing themselves to be inseminated, or even getting a child from someone else, a womb for hire in that situation, and thus, because the two lesbians cannot produce a child as much as they want to, they will never be able to accomplish it without the aid of a man. And so they have to have some type of way in which to have a child, and they want a child, so they go through this procedure. in order to have a child, or two homosexual men. Again, they cannot, no matter how many times they try and might want to, they're not going to be able to have a child. They cannot reproduce. Well, let's just hire someone to let us use their womb, and when the child is born, we'll take the child and raise it within this homosexual relationship. There's a problem then that while the procedure itself might not be sinful, the intent behind it certainly is. You're trying to circumvent God's design for the family and for the home, and thus degrade and denigrate the sacredness of the family unit. That does bring up another question, though. What about giving up a child for adoption? Is giving up a child for adoption immoral? Because is she not giving up her reproductive responsibility in the giving up of that child? Doesn't she have the obligation to care for that child and the responsibility to care for that child? Well, let's face it, that's God's design, but sometimes you have a situation where a woman, or sometimes even still a child, gets pregnant, and they do not have the capability and the maturity to responsibly care for a child. And thus, adoption is certainly a situation where you would have the opportunity to place that child in a home in which that child can be brought to the very purpose that God has set forth for man, the glorification of Him. And thus place that child within a Christian home so that that child can learn and develop in a right way to where when he reaches that level of maturity, he will obey the gospel, or she will obey the gospel, and then glorify God within their life. Is not that a parental and acting from a parental standpoint responsibly when the child or when that person, the parents, cannot provide or cannot do what is necessary in relationship to that child? Of course it is. And so from that standpoint, giving up a child for adoption is not wrong, but a Christian who is looking at Christian principles and wants to do what's right, certainly they should want to do what's right with the child that they have produced. And doing what is right then is going to be placing that child within a Christian, and maybe I should say even a faithful Christian home. Because as we know, a lot of people profess themselves to be Christians, but in reality they don't live it. And they're not truly faithful Christians. They're Christians in name only. But in doing that, they have fulfilled the parental responsibilities that God has given unto them. They are making sure that child is brought up to where they are going to be doing what God wants done within their life. And so, while surrogacy is certainly a difficult question, and there can be many different aspects of it, there certainly is that aspect that would be wrong in simply renting out a womb for lease. it would certainly be wrong simply to try to bypass the arrangement that God has set forth within the family unit. God has designed the family in the way that He wanted it. He designed the reproductive nature of man and woman to be within that one relationship, not outside of it. And yes, there are ways in which that can be honored within the question of surrogacy. But to bypass that or try to avoid that arrangement certainly would be a violation then of God's will and would be wrong. That's why we said intent is so important in so many of these questions dealing with medical ethics. The technology that we have is neither right nor wrong necessarily, but the intent behind it has to be considered. But our lives are to glorify God. That's why we were designed by God, placed here upon this earth. And within that, we are to obey Him. That's the only way that we can glorify Him. We are to obey His will in becoming a Christian, and we are to continue that Christian life in the way in which He set forth. And within the family relationship and at home, we are to train our children to do exactly the same thing, to reach that level of independent maturity so they will obey God's will in becoming a Christian and living the Christian life. The example that we set, though, before them is of vital importance, because we can tell them all day long to do something, but if we don't do it ourselves, if we're not going to live that type of lifestyle, our words will fall on deaf ears. And so if you have not obeyed the gospel, and if you're not living the Christian life this afternoon, then we would encourage you to respond to the invitation of our Lord, to be obedient to His will, and to, once again, enjoy the salvation that comes from Him, with that hope of an eternity with God in heaven. So if you need to come, do so as we stand and sing the invitation song.